The rain fell in relentless sheets as Josh stood at the edge of the park, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his jacket. The cold bit at his fingers, but he barely felt it. His eyes were fixed on Emily, seated on the old wooden bench beneath the willow tree where they had shared so many moments that felt, at the time, eternal. She looked so familiar, yet distant, like a song he once knew all the words to, but now struggled to hum. Josh took a shaky breath and stepped forward. He hadn't seen her in months, not since the argument that had shattered the fragile threads of their love. Back then, it had felt like the end of the world. But now there was just a hollow ache. He wasn't sure if seeing her again would fill it or make it worse. She hadn't seen him yet, or maybe she had, and just didn't care to acknowledge him. "Emily?" he called softly as he approached, his voice barely carrying over the sound of the rain. She looked up. For a moment, her expression was unreadable. Then a small, cautious smile tugged at the corners of her lips. "Josh," she replied, her voice as familiar as the rain-drenched streets of the city where they had built their story. But this wasn't where it had begun. They met in the summer, in a bookstore of all places. Josh had been thumbing through a worn copy of The Great Gatsby when Emily, balancing a precarious stack of books, tripped over a loose shoelace. The books went flying, and one of them hit him square in the chest. "God, I'm so sorry," she had blurted, kneeling to gather the scattered volumes. Josh, holding one of her books in his hand, looked down at her and smiled. "No problem," he said, brushing off the incident. Then, noticing her flushed cheeks and the way her eyes sparkled, he added, "But I think the books are more dangerous than Gatsby's dreams." She laughed, the sound light and melodic, and from that moment, he was hooked. They exchanged numbers, their conversations flowing effortlessly from books to dreams to the wild hopes they didn't dare speak aloud to anyone else. The next few months felt like magic. They explored the city together, danced in the rain, argued over their favorite authors, and stayed up late talking about everything and nothing. Emily was fire, passionate, unpredictable, and burning with life. Josh was the calm to her storm, steady and thoughtful, always looking for ways to make her laugh. But love, as they would learn, isn't always enough. The first cracks in their relationship appeared like hairline fractures, subtle and easy to ignore at first. Emily was ambitious, chasing a dream of becoming a journalist that often kept her away, leaving Josh alone with his thoughts. He wanted to be supportive, but he couldn't deny the sting of being second place in her life. "Emily, you've missed dinner 3 nights this week," Josh said one evening, his voice tight with frustration. He was standing in the kitchen, where the table was set for 2, the candles already burned halfway down. "I know," she said, dropping her bag by the door and sighing. "But you know how important this project is to me. I'm sorry, Josh. Really. It's not just dinner," he pressed, his voice rising. "It's everything. I feel like I'm always waiting for you to have time for me." Emily bristled, her own temper flaring. "I'm trying to build a career, Josh. You know that. Why can't you just be patient?" "Because I'm tired of being patient," he snapped. "It feels like I'm not even a part of your life anymore." She stared at him, her eyes blazing with hurt and anger. "Maybe you just don't understand what it's like to want something so badly you're willing to sacrifice for it. And maybe you don't understand what it's like to love someone who always puts you last," he shot back. The argument spiraled from there, leaving both of them raw and wounded. Neither was willing to give ground, and the gulf between them widened. The breakup, when it came, was messy and brutal. Words were thrown like daggers, accusations cutting deeper than either of them had intended. "I can't do this anymore," Emily had said, tears streaming down her face. "We're just hurting each other." Josh had wanted to argue, to fight for them, but he was exhausted. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "Maybe we're just not meant to be." And just like that, it was over. Months passed. They tried to move on, but the ghosts of their love lingered. Josh found himself thinking of her whenever he passed the bookstore or heard a song she loved. Emily, for her part, threw herself into her work, but there were nights when the loneliness crept in, and she found herself scrolling through old photos of them together. It was a chance meeting at a mutual friend's party that brought them back into each other's orbit. The initial awkwardness gave way to tentative conversation, then laughter as they reminisced about the good times. For a moment, it was like no time had passed. But the wounds were still there, and as much as they wanted to pretend otherwise, they both knew the damage couldn't be undone. "I miss you," Josh admitted one night, his voice heavy with emotion. "But I don't know if we can ever be what we were." Emily nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I miss you too. But maybe we're better off apart." It was the hardest decision they'd ever made, but it was also the kindest. They parted ways for the second time, this time with a sense of closure. Now, standing in the rain, Josh looked at Emily and felt a strange sense of peace. She was no longer his, and he was no longer hers, but the love they had shared was still a part of him, a chapter in his story that he would always carry. "Take care of yourself, Emily," he said, his voice steady. "You too, Josh," she replied, her smile bittersweet. And with that, they turned and walked in opposite directions, the rain washing away the last traces of what had been. It wasn't a happy ending, but it was an ending, and sometimes that was enough.